You know, we've had quite a few tough parables these last few weeks, and today's is no exception. But before we get into that, I want to tell you the tale called the Milk Carton Caper. So my brother Chris was in the 3rd grade at Holy Redeemer many years ago. Now, I don't know how they do things in schools today, but in those days, most of the kids brought their own lunches, and the school would supply milk in those little miniature cartons, those single servings. They cost a nickel each. You remember those? Just little things. Well, he and his buddies were given the job of collecting the nickels for that milk. And one day they decided it'd be a good idea just to keep some or all of the money that they'd taken in. And this went on for a couple of weeks. After all, in those days, folks in our neighborhood didn't have a lot of spare cash, and my brothers and his friends had no idea that somebody else had to pay for that milk to begin with, and so they figured that no one would miss any of the money. Well, it didn't take long for the Holy Names nuns who were running the show there to learn that the milk was gone, but there was no money to show for it. And of course, they went back to the kids that were collecting the money for the milk. And of course, those kids got in trouble. Now, I don't know how they paid it all back, because that 3rd grade gang had spent the money on candy at the corner store on themselves and on their non-involved friends, who themselves became better friends because of the free candy. But they did learn the lesson that stealing was wrong, and forever after, that incident was known at Holy Redeemer as the Milk Carton Caper. Now, what my brother and his friends did was in some ways similar to what our steward in today's parable did. He forgave debt that was rightfully owed to his master in order to secure something for himself once his master fired him. I should mention that this parable has always been very, very difficult to understand. And even 1700 years ago, St. Augustine had to make sure in one of his homilies that his listeners didn't take the parable literally as an excuse for stealing. Well, today we have a rich man and his steward. The steward would be the manager of the rich man's business and financial matters, and he would have overseen his estate or his property. Now, remember last week, we heard about the prodigal son who wasted his father's money. And today we have the steward wasting his master's money. Now, the steward knows he's going to be fired, and he knows that he's not fit for any other kind of work. And so he figures out, very quickly, I might add, a plan to pay off large chunks of debt that his boss's debtors owe to him. In other words, the steward cooks the books. And in the process, he makes friends of the people who owe his boss a lot of money. Now remember, this guy is stealing. One of our 10 commandments is, thou shalt not steal. But something very odd happens. When the master hears about the stealing, instead of throwing the steward into prison or having him beaten, or whatever it was they did in those days, the master called the dishonest steward in, and he pats him on the back for his prudence, for his being clever. Well, Jesus is using that steward to make a point. Toward the end of the parable, Jesus says this: the children of the world are more prudent with their generation than are the children of the light. I tell you, make friends for yourselves with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. And he's saying that the steward, a child of this world, has acted in a way that the children of light, they're followers of Christ, should imitate, but only to the degree that it advances our goal of getting into heaven. And like the steward was, he wants us to be creative and crafty. Now, remember a few weeks ago, we heard the parable of the rich man who built the big barns to store all his grains and all his stuff. He was going to store it for years. And he was going to eat and drink and be merry. And that very night, God said, "You fool, this very night, your life will be demanded of you." Well, the point of that parable was that we should try to do what matters to God. And instead of storing all that stuff for our own earthly security, God wants us to share that stuff with those who actually need it. We call that almsgiving. And we've talked about this before. When we're born, we come into this world with nothing. And when we leave it with nothing. But in between, everything we come into, including our lives, is a gift which comes from God. And he's saying that whatever wealth we build up shouldn't be here on earth, but in heaven. When we acquire or build up wealth in this world, we are to feel free to use it to pay down others' debts that others may not have the ability to pay, or maybe even not legitimately even owe. Our wealth ultimately comes from God, and he wants it to be used to help others. So nothing we possess really belongs to us because it really belongs to God, who is the master of heaven and earth. And we are the stewards of the one true master. And Jesus is telling us in this parable to use what we have, again, what really belongs to God, to help others, the poor, the maimed, the blind, the people who aren't ever able to pay you back. And our reward will come at the resurrection of the just. And if people of this world go to extreme measures to think about providing for their earthly futures, even to the point of stealing, then how much more should followers of Jesus go to extreme measures to prepare for and ensure our own eternal inheritance? And that means serving the Lord with more energy and creativity and ingeniousness than people do in their day-to-day business dealings. And one of the most important ways we can do that is by giving of our resources to the poor. Jesus says our lives are to be based on the love of God and neighbor, and not on the money and things we accumulate while we're here. It's one or the other, and it can't be both. He's telling us to value people more than possessions and to use our possessions in the service of others, especially those in the greatest need. Now, one final note. After the infamous milk carton caper, my brother Chris went on to become an exemplary person. He renounced his life of crime, going on to become a successful mechanical engineer. He married happily. He's got 3 wonderful kids and is a very generous Catholic who puts the needs of others before himself.